Thanks very much, and I must say it's a great joy, a great privilege to be here this morning, and an even greater privilege to be there last night. In the last few months I've attended the Sydney Peace Awards, which was about celebrating those that work for peace in our world. I was at the Australian Human Rights Commission's awards ceremony a little while ago. But last night was special because you're doing something that is very rare in Australia at the moment, and that is to celebrate individual and collective achievement. And you are a remarkable group of people, and it was a lovely joy to spend last night with you. And this morning, of course, also to hear Martin Luther King III. I do want to acknowledge the Gadigal people on the lands on which we stand, but also the Wallamatical people where I live. But I want to put that in the context of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, if I can, just for one moment. In that document, which continues to be the voice and the aspirations of many of our Indigenous community, there is a paragraph that talks about the litany of failures and disadvantages, some of which were reflected last night. But then there is a remarkable line, and the remarkable line is this. It says, the torment of powerlessness. The torment of powerlessness. And what you and I know, that unless we can in fact change the power imbalances in society, in our systems, in our economy, then it is very hard to find justice for Indigenous people, but also for others. But the remarkable thing is, in a sense last night as I watched you and others in the room, is that you're already making a difference to that power imbalance. With every degree, with every internship, with every career that you develop, you eat into that power imbalance just a little bit, but collectively a lot. There's a lot of ways we can try to take power back or give power to people. But in many senses, what you are doing is part of that extraordinarily important journey. So as I talked to my colleague in the Human Rights Commission, Katie Kiss, who's the Social Justice Commissioner, there's sometimes a sense of despair as we look around Australia, particularly in relation to the unjust actions by governments, including Queensland and Northern Territory and others. And that is all true. But once we lose sight of the gains that are being made, the achievements that are being had, then all is lost. And that is not something that any of us can have. So really, just to understand that what you are doing is not just about your own individual well-being and career prospects and your families, but it's making a difference in a very significant way. I've often reflected on the fact that when you talk to First Nations peoples, they start by saying, where are you from, who are your people? In Sydney you say, where do you live, where do you work, and where do your children go to school? And in Melbourne, it's always, where did you go to school? And in a sense, it shows the way in which we think differently. And last night it was interesting, I think it was Mr. King made an observation, and it was this observation, are the organisations and the institutes that you're working for ready for you? And it struck me as a really important question. Because one of the things that I know is that you have the capacity to make the difference. But as people said last night, it's not just about your individual abilities and talents, which are obvious, but it's the ability of those institutions to listen and to welcome you in. But critically important, is it prepared, or are they prepared to be informed by the way you think differently? It's not the same that matters. Sameness is not about anything, it gets you nowhere. It's the difference that is important, the difference in our lives, the difference in the contributions we make. So the challenge for you and I is, are institutions ready to listen to a different way of seeing issues? Social issues, economic issues, issues around the environment, issues around the way in which society actually functions. Because my experience with Indigenous people, as it is with other culturally diverse communities, is that they do think differently about these issues. And it's that different thinking that we have to now bring into these institutions. But are they ready? Are governments really, really, really ready to listen to the voice of Indigenous people in a way that actually changes systems, policies, practices? Are the accounting firms that you work for, are the large financial services groups that you work for, are they prepared to truly listen to your insights? And I don't know the answer to that. You know, I could stand here and say, yep, they've all changed. That's not true. That's not true at all. And if I talk to people from other countries that live in Australia, they say the same thing. And one of the interesting phenomena, given that I've been on the Productivity Commission and I've done, just with that organisation alone, 15 national inquiries, but several others, we often talk about consulting with Indigenous people. And one of the projects I'll talk about in a moment, I've consulted with communities all over Australia over a 10-year period. But consulting's no good unless you actually listen and you take the voices and then you actually prepare to change. And so often when we go out into a community, what we're really trying to do is to consult in order that those people we're consulting will in fact fit into our systems. If you go and talk to any of the, not the Indigenous groups, but groups in Sydney about anything at all, whether it's the Arabic community or whether it's the African community, it doesn't matter which community. Most of those consultations are all about telling them so that they can fit into our system. But what's the learnings that we can take from them? In the area that I'm currently engaged in, which is around age discrimination, and that's about all ages, not only older people, but predominantly old people. What's the learnings from those cultures that inform the way we should care for older people? It's not about them fitting into our systems, it's about us learning. And you're a part of that. And so the question for me is exactly that question that was posed last night. Are the institutions ready to listen to you? I just want to talk just a very little bit about my background, but it's only significant because I think it demonstrates how significant what is happening with you is. My grandfather lived on my mother's side, lived in Redfern, and he was a bootmaker. That's all he was. He was a bootmaker in a factory, and he did that the whole of his life. He never owned the terrace that he lived in Redfern, and that's a great shame because it's worth millions today, but he never did. And his wife was a caremaker, a homemaker, and that was that background. On my father's side, they had properties and they lost those properties during the Depression and never owned another property ever since. He was a caretaker on a place in Darlinghurst and was significantly injured in the First World War just out of Somme. My father then came along and then he did a TAFE degree. And he became a health inspector and ultimately became Director of Health and Community Services in Sydney City Council. And then I pop along, and I'm the very first part of my generation ever to have gone to university, just like you. And isn't that remarkable? It's a remarkable thing to be the first in your generation to have gone to university. Not because university is the only way for success, it certainly isn't. And there are many people far more successful than you and I who will never have entered the grounds of the university. But it is remarkable, and you are remarkable, and you should never not understand that. It is so important. Even more remarkable, my 3 children have all gone to university, and all of their partners have gone to university. And that's astonishing to me, truly astonishing. Now, they could have gone and done other things and be even more successful maybe, but that's amazing. And then I worked with the first Indigenous psychiatrist, Professor Helen Milroy. She was a commissioner with me on the Royal Commission into Child Sexual Abuse. And of course, she heads up a number of things in Western Australia. She came from the most humble of backgrounds, the most unlikely of backgrounds to produce Australia's first psychiatrist. And then her 2 daughters have now got PhDs. Isn't that remarkable? And that is remarkable. And again, it's not the celebration of university degrees as the be-all and end-all. That would be an arrogance that none of us should have. But it shows what can change in very small periods of time. And so today, the real thing is this. There's an expression that you may have used. It says this: you can't be what you cannot see. And for a very long time, people from all different sorts of backgrounds could not see themselves on television, in the news, other than if it was bad news. They couldn't see themselves in positions of authority. And they often say, I cannot be what I cannot see. And you are the people that they will now see. And so what do they see in you? What are the things you would like to be seen as we go forward? I'll come back to that just towards the end. But it's a really interesting notion that you are the people that now others will look up to. And I'm sure you've had people say that to you before, but to me it matters because I do believe you cannot be what you cannot see. And so, the challenge for all of us in these roles, whatever our backgrounds is, what do you want them to see in us? And I think, again, it should be something remarkable. Not ordinary, remarkable. The last thing I want to do before I just talk about some very concrete aspects is, The other thing is about, I saw a text the other day. I'm quite friendly with a nun, Sister Marie Harris, and she runs a boarding house for people with disabilities and mental health issues in Petersham. And she said to a group of students, she said, what you have to do for your future is two things, is to know the gifts and talents that you have, the interests that you have, and combine that with the passion you have and bring them together. And I think that was said last night. The word passion was used a lot last night. But what it is about bringing the gifts and talents together with that passion. But the thing that I've learnt is it doesn't happen to be in the one place, the one job. It is very rare that you will find a job that actually brings your interests and your passions together. And if you've found it, hold on to it. But if you look at life as a range of different things you do, the work you do in the community, the work you do within family, the work you do in charities or whatever it might be, or in causes, and you combine that with the work, you then start to get a balance. What does that all mean? When I left university, I did commerce and law at New South Wales University, and I was a mediocre student, and I remain fairly that way even today. But I ended up, I decided I would not apply to any of the large law practices in Sydney at all, which is a very unusual decision, I have to say, and I can't quite work out why I did that. But anyway, I went off to Orange to be in practice, and when I was there for a second interview, it was raining and blizzardy and awful. I mean, I like Orange, but so by absolute serendipity, I was offered an opportunity to have an interview with a boutique law practice in Circular Quay, which overlooked both sides, both the park and, of course, the water. And when I went for that interview, it was sunny, shiny, the ships were sailing, and you know which job I took. I took the one in the city. But what was very unusual about that job is it only acted for high wealth individuals, Australia's most wealthy individuals. So at the age of whatever it is, 25 or so, I was in a law practice which was very small, very unique, and only acting for Australia's wealthiest people. We acted for Australia's wealthiest man and wealthiest woman, and some of them were miners in Western Australia, and you would know their names, and their companies live on today. And that was fine, and I agreed to do that for 2 years. Now that was a world I didn't understand. I didn't understand wealthy people. I'd never been in a wealthy family, and we certainly weren't. But it exposed me to a new world. And then on one particular day, a client who in fact owned a particular number of mines actually also ran boarding houses and aged care facilities. And at that time, these were not regulated. And she rang up and said, Robert, I want you to evict tonight all of the people in this particular boarding houses. And I said, that's impossible. She said, I want it done. And there were no tenancy rights in those stage. And what's a dilemma? You're a young solicitor, the wealthy client pays hundreds of thousands of dollars to the firm. Do you follow those instructions or not? With a sure knowledge that if you don't do that, you'll be sacked and they'll just get another lawyer. And so what I did in that moment is I actually was connected with the St. Vincent de Paul Society, a charity. And I was actually visiting families right throughout the inner city who were very poor, very disadvantaged. And so without telling the firm, without talking to the clients, I actually arranged for that organisation to provide accommodation for every single person in the boarding house. And it was my practical way of trying to deal with a dilemma. Some of you would say, well, that wasn't very principled, she just said not doing it. But you find ways around it. But that single day made a very clear decision for me, is what did I want to do and how do I want to do it? And so whilst I stayed at that firm for a while longer, I was absolutely determined that I was committed to making a difference for the most vulnerable. But I wanted to use the law to achieve it. So I ended up with Clayton Utz, and I ended up staying as a commercial lawyer for 20 years, not for high wealth individuals, and I vowed I'd never do tax law ever. There was a moral boundary on me which I could no longer cross. So that was done. But it was a conscious, intentional decision to use the law in the best way that I could, whilst achieving a very different objective. And so for 20 years I was a commercial lawyer. For the next 20-something years, and I'm quite old now as you know, I've now been a commissioner on 6 statutory authorities. This is my 6th appointment as a commissioner. And for the whole of that time, I've been involved in non-government organisations, non-profits and charities. I'm currently on 3. My first board appointment into a community organisation was one that was about trying to provide peer support for children in school. And that happened when I was about 25 or 26. So I just wanted to make the point about it's not always found in the job you have. Second thing I want to talk about is I had become president of the Australian Council of Social Service, which is the peak body for working with disadvantaged Australians, low income, and that had arisen because I'd been involved in the work that I talked about previously, working with very disadvantaged families, including in the block down here in Redfern, and I spent many years working with families in that particular circumstances. Ultimately a failed social experiment, but nevertheless it was a great learning experience. But when I was in Jerusalem, and it was between the intifadas, there was this moment of peace, and so they decided to have this international conference there. I decided that the world didn't need more corporate lawyers, and I didn't want to be one. So I made that decision. Now, it wasn't a great aha moment, I want you to understand this. I didn't have somebody coming down saying, change your life, it didn't happen like that. But it was a moment of reflection. And so serendipity played. Having made the decision, I came back to Australia, and I applied for a job as the New South Wales Community Services Commissioner, which was an ombudsman's role that oversighted child protection, out-of-home care, disability services, home care, all sorts of other things. And to my shock and surprise, I got it. And that was a conscious decision to start to do my day what I really were passionate about by night. I didn't know what it would be. I had no idea. I didn't think I was very well qualified. The one thing I also didn't knew, I couldn't work for a government department. I'm very ill-suited to that. I am not a good public servant at all. I am a very bad public servant. And I knew it. So people would say to me, why don't you apply for this? Why don't you apply for the secretary of this department or that later on? And I said, if I accepted that appointment, it would be wrong for me, but it would be a much worse decision for them. And so you have to work out what you're good at. So I had a very rich person the other day said to me, he couldn't understand why I had decided to stop being a commercial lawyer. And he said, why did you decide you want to be a public servant? Well, I said, I didn't think I wanted to be a public servant. I actually wanted to do something good, but use the instruments of government. And so just the point that I make is my niche is not in a public service within a government or agency. It's in statutory authorities. And they're very eclectic. So there was one that I just mentioned to you. There was another one, I was on the National Competition Council, which was all about competition competition policy in Australia and changing, opening up the economy following the Keating-Howard periods. Another one was the Productivity Commission, where I was a commissioner on, as I said, 15 inquiries. And they included things like the health workforce, the early childhood development workforce, paid parental leave, and all those sorts of things. But the weirdest of ones was smash repairs and insurers. Now, who's excited about smash repairs insurance? Well, not I. But I learned a lot about cars, and I learned a lot more about insurance companies. But it was that, and then, of course, the most significant role that I've ever had, of course, was the commissioner on the Royal Commission into Child Sexual Abuse for 5 years, and with 5 other commissioners. The point about that is that in each of those roles, and there's a couple I haven't mentioned, is the capacity to make a difference through the instruments or the capacity of the organisations you're with. And so whether it's in commerce, whether it's in law, whether it's in government, what is the difference you want to make? And in each of those, they are different. But one learning was this, and it came up today about economic participation. If we are going to change society, we have to have 2 things. We have to have a broad mix of considerations: economic, social, environmental, sociological. I'm a great believer in the employment of anthropologists to tell us how we operate. Those skills and disciplines are different, but it's the bringing together of those that is magical. And that doesn't happen enough in government. But in the Productivity Commission, it's sort of fostered. The second is people from different experiences, their own lived experience. I know the word lived experience is used a lot at the moment, isn't it? And it's generally talking about people that have done tough, and so they're going to inform social policy. But lived experiences is all experiences, whether you've been rich or poor, whether you've been in private sector or public sector. It's those rich experiences we bring together. So my view very clearly is good policy comes from a multidisciplinary approach, but also a multi-lived experience approach. That is magical. And I should say one of the policy areas that was mentioned is that for 9 years I headed up the working party of the 9 governments, that's all of the governments in relation to overcoming Indigenous disadvantage. I can say it's one of the most significant pieces of work I've ever done. It's one of the best pieces of work I've ever done, and it's the single greatest failure of my public policy life, because nothing very much changed. And I can come back to that perhaps later. Second thing I just want to talk about is failure and success. People want to talk about success all the time. Winston Churchill said, success is stumbling from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm. And sometimes that's true. So success is fine. And if you look at some of the things I've done, Royal Commission, I think, into the safety of children is really an outstanding one for me. And it lives on. I continue to have lots of involvement with that, including I'm patron of a group for men who were abused as children, both in their families and communities and in the institutions. But failure is also part of it. Let me tell you, failure sucks. You've got all these people out there that talk about failures being necessary for success. Well, let me tell you, failure is awful. Not getting the job you thought you should get is awful. Knowing that somebody less competent than you gets it is even worse. Being in an organisation has to be liquidated. I was at some strange stage. I had 2 interventions into commercial life. One had 4 companies, and on one day, one of those companies had to be liquidated. And I literally went into the toilet, this is true, went on my knees, got sick and vomited, because the pain of that failure was enormous. And it's real. I mean, it's visceral. It's not just, oh, you failed. That's not true. It hurts. It hurts badly. And so, but the one thing about failure is you move from it. You do learn from it. And you can't not do things because of the risk of failure. But don't let anyone say it's easy. You know, there's a whole lot of business people that talk about this. It's like, oh, fail here, fail there. It's all like that. You know, you'd have to almost be emotionally muted to have that feeling. But I do want to say failure is part of life, and you will find it in your own environments. But you cannot allow it to stop you. And that is the message out of this. And I do want to talk about that in relation to workplace. So let me just talk about that for a moment. We are entering an entirely different workplace, but one of the things that's about it for you and for I, well, less for I because I'm going to die much sooner than you, is longevity. We're all living much longer. Right at the moment, if you reach 65, and I'm over that, as you can tell, you have a very high chance of reaching the high 80s. Now that is true. It is not true, as you well know, for Indigenous people, which have much lower levels of lifespans. But putting that just aside for a moment, we are living very long lives. And one of the challenges that I face in my new role is how do we increase the labour force participation rates of older workers? So at 60 years of age, about 60% of us are still engaged in the workforce in some way or another. At 65, it drops to 14% for women and 20% for men. We as an economy need to increase that. But we also need to increase it for the financial well-being as you enter older age. And so we're living very long. The second thing is, when I went into university, there was an expectation you do law, you become a lawyer, and you stay that way for the rest of your life. Today, you've seen the figures, and you will change not jobs, but careers at least 3 or 4 or 5 times. At least that. At least that. And the capacity that you're going to have is extraordinary adaptability. Adaptability to new circumstances, to lifelong learning, all of those things that you talk about in career trackers. But it's absolutely now real. How are you going to live this very long working life of at least 40 to 50 years now in a completely new and different environment? And I heard before you were talking about AI. So the adaptability is going to be the critical issue. And some of us adapt better and some of us don't. But the challenge will be what will enable that within your communities and the people that you work with. But a couple of things I do want to say, and that is this. The first thing is you will face discrimination. I don't know if you've already faced it, but if you haven't, that's terrific. But discrimination has not been eliminated in Australia. Race, gender, age is still prevalent. And you will face it at multiple points in your career. And the challenge for you is how you then deal with it. And I haven't got an answer because it's completely contextual as to the time and place and where you are in your own life. Sometimes you will respond and you will take it up and you'll fight it and you'll do everything you can to do it. Other times you'll do something very different. You'll accept it for a period of time, you'll work around it, you'll find mechanisms. My only point is this, that find mentors and supporters that can help you talk through what you're experiencing. There's no right answer to dealing with discrimination. As an anti-discrimination person, I can tell you there's the law. I can tell you where to go to complain, and you probably should in certain circumstances. But discrimination is live in the Australian community, less than it was in my day, much more so today. I am white, male, born in 1955 and privileged. I face almost no discrimination in any aspect of my life. But I'm the only group probably that doesn't. Everybody else does. Women, people from different backgrounds, your diversity in terms of Indigenous. So I don't know discrimination firsthand, but I deal with it. That's my current job, to make sure people aren't discriminated against. So I want to say that because people gloss over it. It's as though all of our workplaces suddenly magically changed. But the fact that it hasn't is almost not personal. Now I know discrimination is personal, but ultimately it's a systemic failure. It's a systemic failure of our society. Certainly race discrimination is a shocking state of affairs at the moment for all the reasons you know. But it is also systemic within the organisations you work. But again, you can be an influence in the diversity and equity and inclusion programs which you've talked about and other things. You can be a participant in trying to change it. But I just want you to sort of think about that. The second thing is, how will you adapt as you grow older in this workspace? So I've talked about adaptability, but one of the things is you can't expect that you'll be in the same role on the same pay, working the same length of time as you go through. That all changes. And so how will you adapt to those changing circumstances? Some of you are forced on you. Redundancies are much more common in businesses. Even in governments, restructures are happening much more quickly. So it's just about that particular notion. And as you see, given that I have worked in so many different organisations, adaptability is something that I inherently have. Yet, as a child and as a teenager, and even as a young lawyer, I would not have appeared to myself to have been very adaptable, but I have learned that. What I'm not adaptable about is AI. And one of the projects I'm working on, which seems ludicrous, is actually a task force that's looking about how do we educate older workers in AI and technology. Because the truth is, if older workers cannot be retrained in those areas, then in fact they are likely to be actively discriminated against in the workplace. And the people that will do that most are you, younger people, who will look at older people as though they are just wasting space, not able to be AI literate. Now we know that because we've surveyed young people and we've surveyed older people. And we know that younger people see older people in a very diminished sense. Good news is older people see you in an equally diminished sense. They see you as lacking loyalty, not committed, not interested, blah, 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 blah. So you both dislike each other intensely, but you are forced to work together. And that's actually a piece of work we're working on at the moment. It's called Inclusive Multi-Generational Workplaces. Enough of that. Last I want to talk about just is policy. You may have this romantic notion that somehow or another policy is based on good, hard work, and if you've put up a good case, the evidence is strong, it'll get up. Not true. Not true at all. So one of the things that I learned when I was in the community sector as an advocate, I've been an advocate for a long time, particularly ACOS, was that policy development is anything but linear. So I'll give you a couple of examples of that. ACOS for a long time had had a policy about introducing a dental service for low-income people. Couldn't get it up. Hawke Keating government wouldn't touch it. So we shouldn't mention the name of the Prime Minister, which you probably already guessed. We were doing a budget briefing to him about what we wanted, and in those days the Prime Minister used to see me and my colleagues, and that was a regular occurrence. And in the end he started by saying his daughters had just had orthodontic treatment. And I said, fine. So out of nowhere we said, oh, we've got a policy on dental thing. Lo and behold, after 9 years of not getting it up, it was in the budget. And that is an example of how policy gets up. Now the point about that is we had what you have to do is have really solid policies in place. You have to keep them, and you have to keep regurgitating, you have to refresh them in the expectation that an opportunity comes your way. And one of the great things about advocacy is if you do that, an opportunity will come your way. The problem was the next Prime Minister came in, his daughters had perfect teeth, and he got rid of the program. So that's Australian politics and policy for you. Another one was the tax debate. ACOS had been talking about taxes for a long time, and we had done a lot of work on the GST. And the GST is now part of your life, but of course it's a very new thing that the Howard government introduced. Very controversial. But we had come to the view that when Howard was elected that he would probably try to introduce this policy, and we needed to be very prepared. And it has some very significant benefits. And so when this discussion came about, we'd already done all the policy work. And we convened groups with business communities, the industry leaders, and others. And suddenly we had this extraordinary dialogue around tax reform, which has never happened since, that ultimately facilitated the GST and a very substantial change to provide compensatory measures for it. But if we hadn't done that work for years and years, we would have just been left out of that discussion. And the package that ultimately went through, whilst not perfect, was improved. Another example of that was paid parental leave. On the Productivity Commission, I led the inquiry into the introduction of compulsory paid parental leave for all of you. And it's one of the most successful inquiries I've had. But again, people had been working in the sector for years on that. So this was done, 15 years ago. But paid parental leave had been around in industries as a voluntary commitment for years. And it was an example that when the inquiry was held, the sector had all of this information, knowledge, experience already at hand. And as it turned out, when the inquiry was finally released its report, nearly every recommendation in it was accepted. That's very rare, let me tell you. So my last point is really good practice matters. The last one, I'll just go to the overcoming Indigenous disadvantage issue. The problem there was not, there's a thing about Indigenous space which is really confronting, and that is as if we pretend we don't know what needs to be done. That is not true. We know what needs to be done because you've told us what needs to be done. Communities around Australia have told us what needs to be done. And when we were doing this project, we not only looked at the disadvantage, what was going wrong, we looked at what made projects work. Every community I went into, there would be a good project. Problem would be, you would go back 2 years later and it had disappeared. Problem would be, they'd say, oh, it's Auntie Mary, she's wonderful, she's terrific. But as soon as Auntie Mary leaves the program, it collapsed. And the other thing was there was no replication. You'd have a great program in one community, never existed in any other community. So the normal things we see in not-profit endeavour outside of the Indigenous community doesn't work. But we do know what actually makes those projects work at the time. And so we had these great indicators which would drive change, very sophisticated, and well supported by Indigenous communities and individuals. But ultimately the nine governments just wouldn't act on them. And so there was a case of very sophisticated, practical, knowledgeable work supported by the communities which would have made a difference, and we just couldn't get them implemented. So even when you do all of that, and one of the reasons for that was every single new Minister for Indigenous Affairs wanted to introduce a new policy. And I can tell you this, I was on a platform with Tony Abbott when he was the opposition leader and spokesperson for Indigenous Affairs. And Mr Abbott had a genuine interest in Indigenous affairs, some of it very positive, some of it less so. But he gave this policy, and I must have been really shitty that day, because I said to him at the end of it, I said, that's terrific, Mr Abbott, whom I did know through other interactions. And I said, but it really doesn't matter what policies you come up with, as long as you introduce a policy and let it grow and exist for a long period of time. Because what they did is they would come in and immediately say, well, that didn't work, throw it all out and we go again. Remember the period of shared responsibility agreements, Amanda Vanstone. I mean, the most ridiculous notion I've ever seen in all my life. And she told me one day at a meeting, and again, she's a very funny woman and I quite like her. She told me about this agreement that had been entered into in one community about they would upgrade the basketball court by putting a light on it in return for increasing school attendance rates. And they were very excited by the fact that they'd signed this agreement. And I said to them, well, of course they'll sign the agreement, you're going to give them a light. But they had no intentions of actually implementing it. It was this delusional stuff about, oh, we're all going to sit down with the communities, we're all going to come up with these wonderful agreements. And, it was foolish. But what the point was that was not the foolishness of the program, was in fact it just changed, and then we had the intervention, it changed. So my last comment about policy is, it's actually not just about having good policy, it's about the implementation and how do you really sustain that. And now I do need to stop, but that's also linked to advocacy. And one of the things I'd be very happy to chat about, and questions on any of these things, is that sometimes advocacy is soft and sometimes it is hard. Sometimes it's in your face and sometimes it's working behind the scenes. And if you want to get policy up, you have to learn the art of advocacy. And whilst people want to scream and run around, that's good, but often it's something quite different. And that particular art is something that I think some in the Indigenous community understand exceptionally well, others perhaps less so. But in all of the work we do, good quality advocacy matters. To conclude, there's another expression that's SNAIC. SNAIC is the peak body for Indigenous Children's Services, and I've had a lot of association with SNAIC going back a very long day. They came up with a program which was targeted at men, particularly fathers, and it was from the voice of children, and it was really about abuse, but it said, make us proud of who you are. And ultimately, I think, make us proud of who you are is exactly what you and I are seeking to do with our lives. It is about a personal venture. It's about trying to make ourselves better. But in a sense, we want others to be proud of who we are. Our fathers, our mothers, our brothers, our sisters, our children, our people in our communities. And I think you can do that by trying to make a difference in government, in the private sector, in law, in whatever you do. And if you are someone, if you think that is right, make us proud of who you are. I think if you can say at the end of this long journey that we're on, I tried to make a difference in all that I did. A difference for the good of my own family and myself, but also for the community. Just like Mr. King was saying, then I think that is something of which all of our ancestors, sorry, not of all of our ancestors, but all of those that surround us and come after us will be proud of. So thank you for listening, and very hope you're going to ask some questions and comments and criticisms. Thank you.
We do have time for one or two questions. If you pop your hand up, Lachlan has a roving mic and he'll come and find you.
I like questions.
Thank you for the talk, Robert. I was wondering though, how do you make, like you said, when they say they want to make a bunch of policies and do all this stuff, but how do you build that equity and build that through policy? Like, how do you make effective policy, basically, good policy, and then also let it kind of foster and grow?
So the first thing is to understand the issues you're trying to actually confront. So what's the equity issue you're trying to deal with? And often there's big, broad notions of equity, but there's also very narrow issues of equity. So, for example, in the new aged care system, is that an equitable system? Does it treat people from all different backgrounds fairly? That's a sort of a narrow. The bigger equity issues is around the appallingly inequitable tax system we have, which my generation is accountable for. It is it's unaffordable, unsustainable, inefficient, inequitable tax system, and we can't seem to fix it. So they're the big issues. But the second point about equity is also this, and this is a problem with governments. The best public policy is the policy that meets people where and how they live their lives. I'll give you an example in the moment with older people. Older people connect locally. They talk to they live in their local communities, they use the public library, they sometimes even read the mayor's newsletters, they know local groups, they connect with churches. So I say to government, you've got to create policies that meet them where they are. And so often you see in government is they come up with policies that have been created by middle-class, middle-aged bureaucrats and say, well, I just have to fit that model. And that actually is an equity issue, because older people are not going to change. You know your grandmother and your grandfather, they're just not going to change. So if you come up with a policy that is in fact not connected to the reality of their life, it will ultimately fail and be inequitable. And so the challenge in equity is not just a concept, who gets what, and the distribution of wealth and all that, which I'm a big fan of. It's actually about making sure that it works in the reality of those communities or the individuals. And that's a missing element in the current government. Nearly all policy, particularly the Commonwealth, is made by white, middle-class, middle-aged men and women for white, middle-class, middle-aged men and women. Now, I'm about the only person that can say that, because I'm one of those, or I was. I'm now just old. But it's true. And that's where you get inequities. You get inequities not because they're ill-intended. There isn't a government, well, sorry, that's not true. There have been governments that do it, but most governments don't want to be inequitable in their treatment of people. That's not always true, but often their policies are. So it's that informed view. But equity is really, really important, and the tragedy for Australia is we're becoming a much more economically divided community. The rich are very, very rich. The rich that I worked for in my first couple of years would be almost billionaires, all of them by now, without having done much else. And the inequity in Australia is very great. And in America, you see it played out in the complete desolation of the political and social systems. So inequity actually matters. not just in terms of fairness, but actually the way society operates. Yep.
Thank you, Commissioner. My question is about, you touched briefly on the political cycles and different governments. How do you protect organisations like career trackers, and how do you ensure they grow, or what advice do you have to ensure we continue to grow and sort of ring fence and protect organisations like this one over different cycles, given the instability we're seeing and funding instability, etc.?
So I'll give you some practical answers and a couple others. The first is make sure your funding source is not exclusively government. Very important. You have to broaden your income basis, because all of the organisations that rely very, very heavily on government funding are susceptible to the vagaries of that, and it's used against you over time. So for organisations like yourself, you diversify the funding base. The second thing is quite an unusual concept, is to make sure your supporters are from a broad church. That is from different political persuasions, because they have connections into different parties. And so for an organisation like yourself, which is actually about absolutely the good of people, there isn't really a political downside of this. But it's very important to make sure that your supporter base has inflates into different parties. That's not always going to be the case, and I've been in bodies where they're heavily skewed one way or the other. The third is always to say to governments, we're here to help you. Now I know when governments come and speak to you, they'll say, I'm from the government, I'm here to help you. When I was on the overcoming disadvantage, I used to go to all these communities, including the Great Sandy Desert or Tiwi Islands or that, and I would get up in my opening comments, I'm here from the government and I'm not here to help you. Because I wasn't. I was here simply to learn. I wasn't going to give them anything. There was no money, there was no funding, there was nothing. And they were sort of all rights at that point. But my point is, you want to say, we're going to help you. You've got a problem with government, we're here to help. And so the notion of Indigenous economic participation is very important at the moment. All governments are committed to increasing the educational outcomes for Indigenous people, so on and so forth. So you've got something that can help them. And governments of all persuasions are very open to that. Last comment, however, ideologies of the individual ministers are more important than the ideologies of the governments. And so where I've watched real catastrophes is an individual minister comes in with an ideological bent and nothing changes him or her. And they can be entirely destructive. And it's not got to do with Liberal or Labor, although you're obviously going to have a preference. It's the individual minister. So can you work with him or her on the basis we're here to help you? And I think Career Trackers is. There's probably a number of other sort of safeguarding factors that might be relevant. That's good. Good. We're done.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Fitzgerald, for your address to us today, and for all the work that you do for Indigenous communities, but for all Australians who have been harmed or let down by systemic failings. On behalf of the Career Trackers alumni community, we just want to present you with a token of our appreciation, a bundi that has a role in enforcement of authority, can be used in peacemaking as well, very relevant to a lot of the work that you've done in your career. So thank you.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure to hand over to Chair of Career Trackers, Michelle Tierney.